So hi again, I'm Harley. I'm from the Animal Rebellion UK messaging team, and I have developed a workshop. It's not really a workshop, actually. It's kind of a guide more than anything. So I'm going to be talking through it today. So it's designed to be a really useful resource rather than like a presentation as such. So it will be like sent out afterwards and all that, and it's something to use as reference and also like onboarding new people. So it'll mainly today it will be less, me presenting to you and more just talking through it, and as well like having a chance to talk and ask questions at the end. So hopefully nothing in here will be too controversial. It's basically talking about our messaging and how that might look when we're doing externally facing communication like we all do in our roles, whether that be social media or spokespeople, or anything else where we're presenting to the public. So I'm going to share my screen now and we'll get started. So yeah, this workshop is called Staying on Message, and it's a guide for volunteers. So this is an inward facing presentation designed to help people, there we go, help people think about like what it might look like to put Animal Rebellion's messaging in practice. So whereas the story DNA, for example, is all about what our messaging is on quite a meta level, this is more about like what it is on a very practical, everyday level. I really love this quote, so I started with it. Narratives are so powerful, they can swing juries and elections, they can fill prisons, but they can also fill the streets. So everyone here today is in some way involved with leading on Animal Rebellion's messaging. Our DNA, our story DNA is so important because it forms the framework of how we communicate. But the way that is really communicated is through our external communications. So our social media, our spokespeople, our talks and trainings as well. So I just want to kind of point out that if you're here, you are a leader in Animal Rebellion, because you're really that front line of communicating who we are, what we're all about. So today we're going to be covering a bit about why is messaging so important, what is our message, staying on message in practice, and what might that mean for us. So first off, I want to dive into, why do we go on and on and on and on about messaging? Because if anyone knows me, if anyone's been to any of my trainings or presentations, I talk about messaging a lot. I talk about it in many different ways. I think at Animal Rebellion as well, we talk about messaging a lot. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And one of them is because messages make ideas iconic. So I have a logo of Apple here. And the reason for that is because I think Apple as a brand, ethically, they're not that great, but they're a perfect example of how powerful messaging can be. If anyone knows much about Apple, essentially they started off as kind of, just one tech company amongst many, and they were going along kind of fine. And then there was this moment where they did this big rebrand and this big reboot, and they suddenly stopped being a company that sold computers, and they started being a company that sold ideas. So there's this great talk by Apple people. I'll try and link it in the follow-up email, which is kind of about that shift and how they moved away from selling computers to selling this idea of like freedom and liberation, from free speech as well. So, our messaging, the stories that we tell, they have the ability to make the ideas that we're trying to communicate iconic. They have the ability to make ideas stick, and powerful. Messages also unite divided people. So I have a picture here of I think this was a moment in the Pride, this marriage equality campaign. And this is such a fantastic story and movement to show how important and how powerful messaging can be. But similarly, marriage equality, equal rights, regardless of your sexuality, that's an ongoing and very long history of a movement. But there's this there's some really interesting research and like kind of exploration of how the kind of the movement used messaging to change their issue, to change what they were fighting for from something that was very fringe, something that was very kind of about rights and kind of civil liberties, to changing it to be about like love means love, and equal and equality and freedom and justice, and how that really shifted the conversation and changed this from a fringe issue to something that like echoed and spiraled around the world. So messages have this power to unite people who are divided by pulling out shared values and showing how people have the same values, regardless of what kind of container they sit within. And finally, messages change the world. So here I've got some examples of some, like really famous slogans, phrases that have been used in social movements throughout history, which are still used today. So we've got Black Lives Matter, we've got Love is Love, we've got We Are the 99% from Occupy, and Votes for Women from the suffragettes movement. So these are just words that have been arranged in a certain way and said at the right time that have become ideas and like icons and powerful symbols of how society has changed. And there's so many other examples. And all of these have one thing in common. All of these messages that have changed the world, that have changed the way we think, that have changed the way we respond, and that is message discipline. So message discipline, this is the concept that politicians and other public policy advocates should talk about what is relevant to achieve their aims, not allow themselves to be sidetracked either by their own thoughts or the questions of press or audience. So in short, this is really annoying when politicians do it. I'm sure we've all seen it when they're in an interview and the journalist is asking them a question, or we're trying to ask them a question, and they somehow never answer the question, but they talk about everything that they want to talk to. It's horribly annoying when we do it, but it is powerful when we use it. So this is when, we are in situations of talking to the press, we are in situations of talking in a way that we want to get our message out there, and we know exactly what we want to say, and we say that regardless of the leading questions that we get asked. This is how we can have these really powerful radio interviews, media interviews, regardless of the kind of biases and the framing that the person doing the interview is trying to put on us. So message discipline, it gives us consistency, makes our issues unable to be ignored. So I want to jump in here quickly to talk about the idea of consistent messaging and decentralization. So it's kind of like sometimes feels like this balance of getting, unity and pairing and balancing that against autonomy, and people being innovative and creative, and balancing that with having this strong message. So I think, for me, decentralization, it doesn't mean that we don't have alignment. Instead, like our unity and our alignment, that's what allows for decentralization. But this is what kind of is that thing that gives us the speed and flexibility of the individual and the power and wisdom of the group. So when we think about, our SOS and our self-organizing, we ask that everyone, like we say that anyone can take part of Animal Rebellion as long as they align with our principles and values. And that's a great example of that, of how we are open and we want people to be taking action and to be innovative. But if don't have these kind of core things that people are aligning behind, then they're not, it won't seem like Animal Rebellion is taking action. It will just seem like there's another group popping up who might be doing similar things. But if we don't have this kind of unity, and we lose our power. So I think key areas for unity are our visuals, our messaging, and our goals. And this isn't trying to dictate what groups should do, but merely giving the information from the wisdom of the group, which we can use in our own teams to adapt and evolve. So I have a little example about this, which is using the idea of a real estate agent trying to sell a house. So if you're trying to communicate, imagine like there's this real estate agent, they're trying to sell a house. The comparable image to this is, someone trying to sell why someone should be part of Animal Rebellion. So yeah, there's this real estate agent trying to sell a house to someone, and they're like, oh yeah, the house looks like this. It's brown, usually covered in snow, has a chimney, has a window, or it could be this kind of spooky haunted house with quite a nice lawn, or it could be this quite normal yellow house, or it could be this double-story apartment building. Like I think we can imagine being in that situation and being sold this house, which could be any number of things, and being like, well, I like one of those versions, but I'm not sure if I want to be part of that because I don't actually know what it is. So if we think about it, that with Animal Rebellion, we're trying to get people to join the movement, but in any different circumstance, it could have a completely different message, or it could have a completely different tone. Like, people aren't going to feel safe to step into that because they don't know what to expect. They don't know what they're walking into. So I like to think that when we have a unified message, we're creating this Animal Rebellion house, which people know what we're saying, and we can work with them to communicate why it matters to people. So when we say Animal Rebellion, people know that we're nonviolent. People know that we are animal and climate justice. People know what to expect when they walk into that house. And yeah, I think this is a cute little Animal Rebellion house with a plant-based food system change, just and sustainable door, and logo windows. So yeah. So the question comes up of, why does it matter to me? So as Animal Rebellion, we don't have formal leaders. We don't have, the CEO. We don't have the director of the company. We don't have any of those kind of formal positions. Anyone in Animal Rebellion can step into a leadership role, and everyone has the potential to be a leader in Animal Rebellion. We like to say that we're not leaderless, we're leaderful, in that everyone has the ability to step into their power and their capacity to be a leader. And there's so many different ways that people can be a leader. Because everyone is a leader at Animal Rebellion, that means that everyone has the potential to be a messenger, and everyone has the potential to be a face of Animal Rebellion. And this goes doubly so for those in public-facing roles, like in social media, and spokespeople, and other roles that directly kind of interact with people who might not be part of the organization yet. So I think messaging really matters to all of us, because we don't rely on, like, our PR person, for example, to go out and say what needs to be said. We don't rely on, the social, like, just the social media team to kind of communicate our message, and everyone else doesn't really need to know what is going on. Because of the way we are organized, we want everyone to be able to understand and communicate who Animal Rebellion is, because that's how we make sure that we're being as powerful as we can be and bringing in as many people as we can be. A question that I think comes up quite a bit is this idea of, but what if I don't agree? What if there's stuff in Animal Rebellion's messaging that I don't personally agree with, or that I think should be changed? And I think something that we talk about in our story DNA, and I think something that's really important, is this idea of seeing the difference between our personal story and our shared story. So personal stories, they give us the opportunity to connect with each other and build trust. These stories are often raw and unpolished. So these are the stories that we tell of why we, fight for animal and climate justice, why we choose to dedicate our time to these movements, why we choose to do this. And then there's a shared story as well. And this is a strategic practice story that increases our power by framing the messaging and understanding of our movement. So our shared story is the thing that incorporates all of our DNA. It incorporates what we're trying to communicate. And it's important that it might not capture every part of our personal story. It might be a little bit different. It might be a little bit not exactly what we might communicate. And I think this is like, I want to stress this as well, because this is true for a lot of people, and it might be true for you. It might be true, like, for me as well. Like, for example, if we're thinking about, climate and animal justice, like, I do a lot of other stuff outside of Animal Rebellion, which is focused purely on, like, anti-speciesism. And that's an important part of Animal Rebellion, but it's not the only part. So when I come into Animal Rebellion, I'll put on a different hat, which is that I don't talk about animal justice without talking about climate justice, which might be different for what I do in work outside of Animal Rebellion. And I think it's important to say that there's space for both. Personal stories are when we're talking to people as us, as individuals, as, Harley, as Angela, as Charlie, as Alison. When we're speaking as Animal Rebellion, however, that's when it's our shared story. So when we're in a public-facing role, while we're still individuals with rich lives, we are speaking on behalf of Animal Rebellion. So this is when we're online, this is in interviews. And in these situations, our shared story gives us unity and greater collective power. So this is, many people saying the same thing. And we can see this and how this takes effect in online spaces. For example, on Twitter, many people saying the same thing leads to more people seeing a message. I think that's kind of a great little, kind of just an example of how shared stories can be so powerful. I'm just going to leave this quote up for a little bit. I won't read it out, but if people want to read it, I think it's very nice. So the next section I'm going to jump into is to talk about what is our message. And some of you might have already seen, but the messaging team just this week released an updated version of our messaging guide. So that goes in a lot deeper about what our messaging is, things like our frame, things like our, the slogans that we've used, our kind of meta narratives and things like that. So I'd really encourage people to check that out, and I'll link it as well when I send the follow-up through Charlie probably. But I wanted to touch briefly on what our message is, just as a bit of a refresher. So my first slide is about, what is narrative? So we talk a lot about narrative and stories and messages, and they're often used interchangeably as well. There's lots of different versions probably out there. What I like to use quite simply is that narrative is the bigger picture, the collection of many stories on an issue. It's not boundaried, so it doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. It's endless, it's limitless. Whereas stories make up narrative, so these are bounded. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is an example from a film which I really like. Most people who I know that I really like this film. It's a film called Spirit. And for example, like if you think about, film examples, the narratives in this would be things like freedom, unity with nature, friendship. They're often similar to values, but the story is that specific bounded story of, this horse's journey from being free to being captured to being free again. If you want to have a good cry, highly recommend the film. But yeah, so I wanted to just briefly touch on that. So when we go on to the next slide, which is about our narrative and about our stories, it will sit within this context. So this is kind of what we've got at the moment. This is the messaging that Animal Rebellion really started with and has continued with, adding bits and pieces on as we've gone as well to be relevant and stay contextual. So our central narrative is this idea of animal and climate justice. I also included a little thing there of like includes all life as well, because this is something that's come up quite a bit in conversations that I've had, which is that we want to be sure that we're stressing that we care about human justice as well. We want to stand in solidarity with the global justice movement. Our central story is this idea that we can't end the climate emergency without ending the animal emergency. So this is something that we communicate with everything that we do. When we're talking about a plant-based food system, we're talking about that because our story is that without this necessary change to animal agriculture, we can't address the climate emergency. We also have another central story, which is that we listen to the science. We listen to what science is telling us. We listen to what is being communicated through, peer-reviewed science, and we follow that. And we do that to the best that we can with everything that we do, which also means that, all the messaging we put out is, from the most relevant and up-to-date science as well. We have a problem narrative as well, which I would say this is kind of more of like a problem meta narrative. It's quite, higher up, and it's not something we may explicitly talk about. I don't think we do explicitly talk about it because it's hard to do while sticking to, no blame, no shame. But we do have this problem narrative of human domination and exploitation. But the problem story, which is what we do often talk about, is that animal farming and fishing is a leading cause of the climate and ecological emergency. Our solution story, which we talk about quite a bit, and this is gone into a bit more detail in the messaging guide, is that end animal farming and fishing and transition to a just and sustainable plant-based food system. This is like the idea of transformation, that we need transformation. So, this is expressed in different ways, and we'll have, food system change now, as well as like the problem story is also expressed in different ways. For example, from things like animal farming equals pandemics and climate crisis, still part of that same problem story. So these are the raw ingredients of our messaging. These are kind of the very basic, and yeah, these are some raw ingredients on the slide in case you didn't know what they were. Gosh. So yeah, and I wanted to stress that these are raw ingredients because I think it's important that they need to be cooked. And what I mean by that is that, while we may use these in their raw form in some cases where we might say something like, end animal farming and fishing, transition to a just and sustainable plant-based food system, we can also develop messaging which includes these narratives and stories at their heart, but maybe expresses it using different words to appeal to different audiences, or expresses it in different ways, or sits it within a kind of a bigger frame or message. We also have this, which is kind of an overarching statement, an elevator pitch, whatever you want to call it, which puts all of this together. So Animal Rebellion is a mass movement that uses non-violent civil disobedience to bring about a transition to a just and sustainable plant-based food system as an attempt to halt mass extinction, alleviate the worst effects of climate breakdown, and ensure justice for animals. So this is what brings all of that together, and this is what allows us, well, part of what allows us to communicate with other people externally from Animal Rebellion and share what we're all about. And I think this is also really great to be used as like, a raw kind of thing to refer back to and to check in with and to think, is something I just wrote, or is something like a speech or a post or an article or anything, is this in line with this? Is this kind of sticking to this? And yeah, I think, it's kind of like our mission statement. I think mission statements are really great for that. On this slide, I put a couple of slogans that we've used in the past, which kind of examples potentially of, cooked versions of our messaging. And on the next slide, I included our frame. So this is, what's inside of our frame, and what might be outside of our frame. So inside of our frame, we have things like animals as individuals. We don't see animals as, being just part of nature or not important as individuals. We have injustice connected to animal farming, human, animal, planet. We have this idea that people can make change, justice for all. We have other things inside our frames as well, like animals and climate, food system change, urgency, and pandemics and crises, and connecting those to animal farming. Outside of our frame, we might have things like animal suffering and animals as victims, because we don't talk about animals as victims, we talk about them as individuals. We have personal change outside our frame, as well as animal rights. And I think this is important to point out because we very specifically use the word animal justice rather than rights, because rights are allocated by the state and can be taken away, whereas justice is a principle that can be given by the people, and maintained by the people. So that's also, we have a bit on language in the messaging guide. We keep anger and aggression and violent messaging outside of our frame as well. We also keep victim narratives about us as humans out of our frame as well. We don't see humans as victims or powerless. We see them as agents who can make change. While we have urgency inside our frame, we have emergency outside our frame. We try and keep balance urgency with hope, to use hope-based communication to make sure people are going to actually take action rather than hide in a hole. And we also have blame outside of our frame. We don't blame and shame, as I think we all know, as part of our principles and values. We prefer to kind of talk about how we can all make change in this system. This is a sample message. This was developed for Reforest Parliament Square as a brief for spokespeople. And I wanted to give this as an example of how we can kind of pull all of this together, all this idea about our messaging. And I specifically used an example from quite early on, and this was even before the first rebellion. Angela, I think you might be familiar with this one. I wasn't there. Because I wanted to show how, this was very early on when the messaging was kind of just developed, so it was all fresh. So I think it's a good example to use. So yeah, this is also a really great way of framing different messages of the context, the conflict, and the demand. And I would also make sure to include, the hope, making sure that we're giving people to say something to say yes to. So yeah, I just want to put this example here. Maybe take a minute now to have a read through. So I think what's really great about this brief, this sample message, is that, it has animals and climate. It talks about animals as individuals, alongside future generations. I think what could be improved is the idea of giving people something to say yes to. So making sure anyone reading this or kind of being part of this can know what they can do, how they can change, and seeing that hope and that future. And this is what takes us into hope-based communication, which everyone has already probably heard me talk about ad nauseum. But this is the idea that we can use our messaging to allow people to kind of step up to the plate and know how they can make a difference and to take back control of our messaging. So hope-based communication is a way of regaining our control over what we say and what we do. So these are two quick quotes about it, which I'm just going to skim past for now. If people are really interested, there's a whole training on hope-based communication on our YouTube. But basically it centers around these 5 shifts. So shift 1 is giving people to say something to say yes to, so talking solutions. And I think a really good one to put in here is like 1 part problem, 2 part solutions. Shift 2 is connecting to global values. So these are kind of universal values. These are things like, peace, justice, freedom, things that, most people believe in, or at least think they believe in. Shift 3 is creating opportunities rather than threats. So rather than saying, if you don't do this, we're all going to die, saying, you have the chance to change this and build a better world for future generation. So this is the idea of being builders, not fighters. So we're not fighting, constantly pushing back against this system that is just doomed to kind of go to shit. We're building something better. Shift 4 is support for heroes rather than pity for victims. And I think this really ties into the way we think about animals in our messaging as well. We don't see them as powerless victims. We see them as, part of a group who are kind of on the front lines of this and who deserve to be supported and lifted up as powerful. And I've used rehumanize in here as the best word that there is available, but I don't think it has to just be about humans. And yeah, shift 5, one of the most important ones, is show them that we got this. everyone wants to be associated with victory. Everyone kind of gets on board when something seems like it's winning. There's a lot of people, and I can say this with complete confidence, a lot of people want to see change in the world that we're in. And I think for a long time in social movements, we've been operating under the assumption that we are pushing issues that no one cares about. But I think a lot of research has shown that a lot of people want change. A lot of people think the status quo isn't working. One of the biggest problems is, though, they don't believe change can happen. So when they see people making change, when they see people having wins in their community, that's something a lot of people want to be part of. So another slide about why hope-based communication, what it allows us. And this, the reason I'm putting this is I think it's really important when we're thinking about how we develop messaging, thinking about how we can use those shifts to create empowering messages, whether that is on, through a Facebook post, asking people to, get involved, whether that's through, fundraising, crowdfunding campaign, showing people how this is something that they can do that will really help, whether it's through a speech at an event, showing people how they can get involved, or whether it's through, an article or even our newsletter and things like that. So the next section, which I think is the final section, is what does staying on message look like in practice? So we've talked a lot about our message, and we've talked about why messaging is important, but how do we translate that into platforms and the teams that we're in? So first off, it should look like sticking to our values. I think specifically ones that come up quite a bit when we're talking about messaging are no blame, no shame, and non-violence. And I want to stress here that these, all of our values, are things that are made to be talked about and to be discussed. So for example, the other day we had a great conversation in an art space about what does non-violence mean? What does that look like in practice? And I think these are things that are always should be talked about and should be developed upon. Non-violence in messaging particularly is really important because something might, come across as a violent message to some person, but another person might completely not see it. So I think, a good rule of thumb for me is that if it seems violent, then it's worth discussing. So rather than being like, oh, well, no one else thinks it's violent, so it's fine. I think, if one person does, then other people are going to as well, if we multiply that on potentially hundreds of people who will see a message. And no blame, no shame is also another really, really good one to be discussing and talking about. And I think this comes down to our targets, as well as to, people who we're communicating with. We're going to touch that on a little bit more about, what it looks like to stay on message. Staying on message also looks like sticking to our frame and our DNA. So, climate and animal justice, not talking about one without the other. Open and inclusive organizing and targeting the government is a really important one. System change and nonviolent. So I'm going to touch briefly on what it might look like on platforms. And these slides have quite a lot on them. As like I said, this is not this one particularly, the next ones. As I said, this is supposed to be used as like a resource guide where people can flick to the relevant sections that they want to look at. So yeah, if there's too much and you can't take it in now, don't worry. This is just a very quick overview. So what we do and don't share. This is basically just kind of a little bit of a guideline. And this can, there's always situations and it's ultimately down to the team and discussions amongst the team. And I think that's a really important thing when we think about external communications. It should never just be one person having to make a call on something. It should be a team thing where people can talk to each other and communicate with each other. So, I think we've always aimed to share a lot of original content created by the social media team and the graphics team, making sure it's on message, and graphics created by Animal Rebellion. We share, talks and trainings and events hosted or co-hosted by us, or talks and trainings and events which are, really relevant to what we're trying to do. animal rebellion actions that we had been informed about beforehand, particularly animal rebellion actions that we didn't know about, as long as they are on message and follow our principles and values, news that is relevant to a plant-based food system, news and updates that are relevant to both animal and climate justice, XR actions in some cases if we think they're really important and really relevant, and some solidarity posts. And I want to stress like being careful with these, because I think it's great. Like, I think it's fantastic to show solidarity, but in some cases, if we're sharing solidarity posts without being part of the movement that we're showing solidarity with, it can seem a little bit tokenistic. So I think it's always good to ask a group beforehand if it would be helpful for them for us to share a post about what they're doing, if possible. So don't share with posts written that don't have a clear purpose. I think sometimes that can be, I've worked on social media, and there's a lot of pressure to get stuff out always. And sometimes it's just like, oh, we might as well do something rather than nothing. But I think, if we have posts that don't communicate our message, then they're not really doing anything, even if they are going out. Content that doesn't link to a plant-based food system. So this kind of ties in as well with like animal rights only content. Animal rebellion actions that are not in line with our principles and values or are off message. And there's always like, we have the whole media messaging team where we can talk about things like this as well and get second opinions and have conversations. We don't share personal opinions, and this is both, on our channels and also in things like chats and messages. Messages and comments. So if we wanted to kind of dive into like what we personally think, like that would be something we'd do personally rather than as Animal Rebellion. Posts that focus only on climate or only on animals, we focus on both. Graphics would aren't in line with our graphic design guidelines, which our design guidelines are really great. I have them linked later on. Graphic footage or images, there is a lot of talk, a lot of conversation, and not much consensus about whether graphic footage or images are violent or can be construed as violent. But I think to this stage, I haven't seen any kind of unification on that, so it's best kind of just not to share those. Blaming and shaming and language that would cause harm to a group of people. I think we all know a lot of what those words are, and it's just always best not to use them if we're going to alienate a whole bunch of people. And conspiracies as well. So this is ideas that aren't backed by scientific consensus. So other tips: keeping it professional, proofread each other's posts. I know I've put stuff out before with, embarrassing spelling mistakes, and I'm like, oh gosh, I wish I had someone read that. Could have saved me a lot of heartache. Offer hope and non-binary solutions. So not saying this is the only answer. For example, like one particular form of technology is the only answer, saying that, there's many ways that can get us to a plant-based food system. If in doubt, be precise. Our personal FB page is not the place for long-winded kind of rants. I think we all know this. I'm speaking the obvious. It can help as a team to create a character profile for your social media voice. This applies to, anything like writing a speech as well. This is something that I've done in previous teams when I've done social media. It's thinking about, if your social media voice was a person, what would they sound like? What would they say? Like, what language would they use? And it helps with unity if you have a lot of different people writing content, because then you're all not kind of going in there with very different voices. Developing a social media strategy, what you post, how often, and for what purpose. Thinking about Animal Rebellion strategy, thinking about, does this need to be shared by us? We're not a promotion page or a personal page, so there might be some content that doesn't need to be shared by us because it's already being shared by everyone else. And I think it's really important that one good quality post a day is worth 1,000 times more than 50 poor ones. So spending time thinking and writing. So the next little bit is in outreach, including online. I'm going to speed through this because we're running out of time. But basically, the kind of key points is that focusing on who we can empower, mobilize, and persuade. So if anyone has seen like the spectrum of arrows idea, we have this spectrum of people. We have active supporters to active opponents. And the first three, like active supporters, passive supporters, and neutrals, they're the ones who we can really, really get to with our messaging. And that's who we really should be focusing on, and bringing in this idea that we can, empower people and bring them to act, mobilize maybe our passive supporters who haven't yet taken action, and persuade our neutrals. It's also important to notice that facts bounce off frames. So if we're just going in there with fact after fact, people, if they already have a pre-established view of the world, which our facts disagree with, they'll just completely ignore it and disagree. Whereas stories and messages communicated as narratives or a lot more stories are a lot more powerful in breaking through to people, especially ones which link to shared and global values. So other tips here as well for outreach, including online, staying polite. We don't have to agree with people, but we do have to maintain nonviolent discipline. That includes our language. Threats, blaming and shaming, insulting is not okay at Animal Rebellion, whether that's in person or in a chat or in a message or in a comment. If someone is angry or stressed, listen first. We try and practice active listening, trying to understand people's perspectives, but first ask if this person is persuadable. We don't have to engage in conversation with anyone. We're all volunteers. We have limited time. We need to be focusing on the people we can engage with. Offering, not arguing. We're not here to convince people our way is the right way. We show through actions why people should join us, and offering the people the chance to get involved. And if something upsets you, it's okay to take a breath or ask a teammate to respond or take over. We're human. Some things might be harder for us to hear or to talk about, and it's totally okay to step away and not be involved in a certain conversation if it's just too hard. I think that's a really important one. We don't have to be, superheroes doing everything. So in our language, try and be hopeful, accessible, carefully chosen. That means we carefully choose the words we use, and be simple and precise. So I think it's better to say, 5 words rather than 200 words a lot of the time when we're trying to communicate with this. And sometimes, there's a lot of space for 200 words. But I think for me, it helps to really think, can I say this in less words? Does this story need this piece of information to make sense? And I think that can help boil things down and make it a lot more powerful. And yeah, just remembering that words mean things, and this means that words have associations attached to them. So and this kind of ties in with carefully chosen. So when we're building a message and we're using certain words, just stopping for a second and thinking, what does that word mean to people? And this is where proofreading really helps, to get someone to read over and be like, what comes to your mind when you read this? And our visual messaging. So when I'm talking about, staying on message, doesn't just refer to our language messaging. It also refers to our images and our graphics. So in this picture, hidden away in this picture, there's 2 links. So if you click on the yellow pig, you get a link to the graphics Mattermost request channel, which is where you can request graphics. And yeah, that's a really good place to go to get, Facebook graphics, to get things for the website, social media, whatever. And if you click on the green cow, you get a link to the social media brand guidelines, also really useful. So yeah, there's some little Easter eggs in this slide. So have fun with that. And I think, yeah, our visual messaging is so important. The graphics team is amazing. All these illustrations are hand drawn, I recently found out. So yeah, they're an incredible team who put a lot of work into developing our brand guidelines. The final thing I'll touch on before I finish up is, what do we do when we make mistakes? So we all make mistakes. We all say things that we think better of later on. We might and when we're in externally facing roles, our mistakes might have a bigger impact, and that's not that we make more mistakes, you know, we probably make a lot less mistakes than other people in other parts of the organization, but they're more likely to be seen. So I've developed 3 Ds of making mistakes, which are delete first, ask questions later. So if there's a post that goes out and someone kind of comes to you and goes, hey, I think that's really offensive. For me, I think the best thing to do is just take it down, then talk about it, because it can always be put back up. Whereas if it stays up and people are offended, that's something that takes a lot more work to clean up. So yeah, deleting first, asking questions later, discussing things as a team, so bringing in more perspectives, and don't defend or deny. And this doesn't refer to discussing things as a team. This refers to kind of publicly, if someone's accusing, kind of making an accusation or making a claim that something they read was inappropriate or offensive or whatever, it's always best to, you know, discuss things as a team and come up with an approach that doesn't rely on just saying, well, it's not offensive or we didn't say that. So yeah, they're the 3 Ds. And we all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn as a team and grow. So recap, your role is important. Don't be afraid to ask for support or advice. The messaging team is always happy to read things over, but you know, you have all the resources you need in your teams. It's better to post less with more thought. And I think this goes for every kind of external messaging, and our messaging is our strength. So let's keep it strong. So I want to finish by saying, you know, as I said at the start, you are all leaders. That's why you're here. You can empower people. And there's plenty of resources as well to help. Some of them which I've mentioned are the messaging guide, which I'll make sure to share, the brand guideline, the graphics brand guidelines as well, which I'll also make sure to share. So thank you. We have 9 minutes left, so I will finish up there and make sure we have time for any questions. Yeah, just quickly, that was a real speed run through. So definitely, you know, take some time to look through the slides in your own time if there's stuff that you want to think about further. And yeah, this is made to be a guide, a reference guide that can be used at any point to help out. So I hope it's helpful. Thank you.